All right. Good morning to everyone here on the West Coast, and good day to everyone everywhere else you may be. I am Scott Newbern, the Chief Technology Officer at AeroVironment. Thank you for joining us today for our IDEO Room discussion. Our topic today is how artificial intelligence and autonomy will enable faster, more effective operations at the contested tactical edge. For our format today, we will have speakers present ideas and then move to discussion and fielding questions. Some of you have already submitted questions when you registered, but you also have the ability to submit questions as we progress today. Those will be private and we will not identify who asked each questions. Just put those in the chat and we will answer as many as we can as time allows. We've assembled a distinguished panel of speakers today, and to get things moving, I will hand this off to General Scott Wallace. He's going to kick off and moderate the discussion for us today. Over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks for the opportunity to moderate today's discussion on how artificial intelligence and autonomy enable faster, more effective operations at the contested tactical edge. First, let me introduce our panel members. The first is Dr. Thomas Withington. Dr. Withington is an award-winning analyst and writer specializing in electronic warfare, radar, and military communications. He's written widely on these subjects for a range of specialist and general publications. He also works as a consultant and advisor in these areas for several leading government and private sector clients. Dr. Withington provides regular commentary on security and defense aspects of electronic or electromagnetic spectrum use for major media organizations around the world. And Tom, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our second panel member is August Cole. August is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on Strategy and Security, where he directed the Council's Art of the Future project, which explores creative and narrative works for insight into the future of conflict from its inception in 2014 through 2017. He works on creative futures at Spark Cognition, an artificial intelligence company. He is a regular speaker to private sector, academic, and U.S. and allied government agencies. Unfortunately, our third panel member was unable to join us this morning. Peter Singer, a strategist at New America, had a family emergency at the last minute and had to bow out of our discussions. But given that we've got two very knowledgeable folks still on the panel, we will proceed, and I'm sure you will find it enjoyable. As moderator, I get the privilege, honor to provide some introductory comments. First, let me thank our panelists for their time and interest in the subject. I offer three comments at the outset. First, I think it's important for us to understand what we mean by contested tactical edge, so that we're kind of sort of on the same page. In my mind, the tactical edge is where the real work gets done. It's where one is in direct contact with an adversary. It's not strategy development. It's not campaign planning and execution. It's not national level intelligence gathering. It is where decisions and execution have near immediate impact on the outcome of engagements. And in Army speak, in my mind, it's the individual soldier, the squad, platoon, company, and maybe even battalion level when we're talking about the contested tactical edge. Second, there seems to be, to me at least, to be an elephant in the room with regard to network connectivity, without which some of the capabilities that we talk about with artificial intelligence and autonomy are at least limited, if not rendered ineffective. It's at the tactical edge also that where network connectivity and maintenance thereof is the most fragile. And as we talk about the subject and we talk about the tactical edge, it seems to me that we need to keep that in mind, that at the tactical edge, there is some fragility in their ability to maintain connectivity, either due to priorities or distance, or perhaps both. Finally, there's a matter of trust. At the tactical edge, trust is an imperative in my judgment, and trust is frequently developed through tough and realistic training and shared experience during operations. Do you trust your leader? Do you trust your buddy to have your back? Do you trust your weapon to function properly under the circumstances, et cetera, et cetera? So enter autonomy and artificial intelligence. How do you gain trust in what in the future is likely to be a member of your team at the tactical edge? I was at a conference a number of years ago talking about autonomy, and one of the questions that was raised, which I thought was really interesting, was, would you take a bullet for your robot? Which I think is still an interesting question to delve into. Anyway, those are my introductory comments, and I hope they help frame what we're going to talk about over the next few minutes. And at this point, let me introduce Dr. Tom Witherington's presentation to get us started.
We have to recognize that artificial intelligence is now a reality in defense applications. The reason it's becoming a reality is because ultimately artificial intelligence accelerates the pace of human decision-making and thus the pace of human action. It quickens the famous OODA loop, observe, orientate, decide, and act, that was pioneered by the US strategist John Boyd in the 1950s. Future US, NATO, and allied military postures will effectively depend on artificial intelligence. This is not something we're talking about 5, 10, 15, 20 years hence from now, by which time artificial intelligence will very much be part of everyday military operations. But it's happening now. A good example of this is the Joint All-Domain Command and Control System that the US Department of Defense is moving forward with. JADC2, as it is known, places a heavy emphasis on artificial intelligence and machine learning. And these two things are very much at the core of the entire JADC2 approach and the JADC2 architecture in general. But there's a few things that we need to keep in mind when we're contemplating the increasing uptake of AI and its cousins within the wider defense enterprise. The first one, and perhaps the most obvious one, is the famous dictum of all computer scientists: garbage in, garbage out. If you put bad data into AI, you will get bad decisions and you will get bad outcomes coming out of the other end. Artificial intelligence is ultimately only as good as the data it receives. And this creates a problem. Fortunately, we live in a world where NATO, US allied involvement in conflicts around the globe is relatively limited. On the one hand, this is a good thing, but on the other hand, this also gives us a finite amount of data that we can work with. When we're looking at harnessing AI for use by the military, we're dependent on gathering data from military situations, and these can be few and far between. So this is something we need to think about. How do we get the data we need? How do we ensure that that data is reliable and can be used in a productive way? As an adjunct to that, the militaries need to be able to trust artificial intelligence with their lives, because lives will ultimately depend on it. Building trust is effectively a sine qua non if artificial intelligence is to be used and to realize its full potential at the tactical edge. And this creates another problem. We live, most of us in the West, in NATO, in allied countries, for instance, we live in democracies. And for AI to work and for the military uptake of AI to work, the people participating in those democracies, the voters, the taxpayers, for example, need to be able to trust the technology and they need to have faith in it themselves. After all, it's their money that is being spent on it. The whole defense enterprise, that includes absolutely all of us, needs to be highly aware that there is an imperative that we must fight back against false narratives. We've already seen the development of the killer robots narrative regarding autonomous systems. This is in many cases absolutely false, and it is also dangerous. Misinformation and ill-informed debate helps absolutely nobody. So we must be prepared to go out there and wave the flag, but do so in a responsible way and a truthful and honest way. We need to share with the population what AI can do in a military context, but perhaps more importantly, what it cannot do and what it will not do. The reason we need to think about all of these things is because ultimately some military tasks in the future will simply be impossible without artificial intelligence, without autonomy, without machine learning. A good example of this is military operations in the electromagnetic spectrum. So this is the practice of electronic warfare. This is the examples of trying to find out what the enemy's doing, how is it communicating, how is it using its radios, how is it using its radars, how is it using its satellite communications, all of these kind of things. The electromagnetic spectrum and the radio spectrum is simply too congested now for the human brain on its own to be able to comprehend not only what is going on, but also where the target is, where the threat is, what the threat's doing, how it's going to behave. We're already seeing an uptake of artificial intelligence within the electronic warfare domain, and this will only increase in the future because it will simply be impossible to perform EW, to perform EMSO, electromagnetic spectral operations, to their full potential without using this technology. So we have a lot of things to think about. We have a lot of conversations that we must have and debates that we must wage. And I think over the next 45 minutes, the next hour or so, we'll have an excellent opportunity to hopefully scratch the surface of these a little bit, but more importantly, to get those conversations and to get those debates going. And that's me done.
Okay, well, thanks, Tom, for your presentation, and I hope those of you in the audience found that useful, and we'll delve into some of that, I'm sure, over the course of the next 50 minutes or so. I would remind folks in the audience that if you do have questions, you can enter them into the chat box on the presentation, and as we have time, we will try to get to your questions. At this point, let me start the question and answer portion of our presentation with a question for August Cole. August, you and Peter Singer have coined the phrase useful fiction. How is that being used to explain current and future technologies, and why are you doing it all? Why is it useful?
General Wallace, thank you. It's a great question. And just before I answer, I just want to quickly clarify on my background and biography. I no longer work at Spark Cognition. It's been a couple of years. Great team there, to be sure. And a bulk of my effort is actually working with Peter Singer on useful fiction right now. Our collaboration began out of thinking through the future of warfare through novels like Ghost Fleet, Future of AI and Robotics with Burn-In, and that's really an outgrowth of this idea that imagination and story are needed more than ever to understand technologies that are moving so fast that, like, ordinary analytics and foresight practice techniques can't really keep pace. Now, I would never say that you should write a national security strategy off of a fictional product like a novel, but at the same time, it is one tool among many. And of all the kind of ways we could go about thinking through these questions of the future of, say, robotics and artificial intelligence, not just in the battlefield, but how they're going to transform society, to us, it feels like narrative is one of the most effective ways to do it because it focuses on the human dimension. In your comments, you'd mentioned trust. That is such a core element, and it's really difficult to understand in an applied way unless you can really imagine the future or the scenario in which it may really become critical, and to do so from, again, a positional and human point of view.
Thanks, August. Let me just ask a follow-up. In your book, Burn-In, an FBI agent is given, I guess, a prototype of a robot with the idea of using the inherent AI capabilities of the robot and to kind of teach the robot, how to operate in a live environment. As the book goes on, though, it seems to me that the human master, if you will, of the robot is being burned in at the same time that the robot is being burned in. Is that intentional, and is that how you see the future of AI being assimilated into organizations?
Another great question. It does go back to that concept of trust that you raised. Agent Laura Keegan, who's on this counterterrorism hunt, is paired with TAMS, a biped type robot that has access to the cloud more or less. And indeed, there is, even for her, someone who has a lot of experience working with tactical robotics. When you begin to spend more time with a system and see how its capabilities change and evolve based on its interactions with you, but also the access to more data, suddenly you have a richening and deepening in that relationship. At the same time, I think we can think about many of the objects that and mechanical devices that we have relationships with, whether it's a mechanical watch or an old car. We can ascribe personalities to some of those kinds of traits in operation, especially the things that are imperfect, right? And I think that's an element too in trying to really consider how we trust machines that are fundamentally guided by software.
Okay, thanks a lot. You mentioned communications and networks, so let me turn to Tom Withington for a moment. Can you provide a few observations about communications and networks and what cautions we should be aware of relative to AI and autonomy and future network capabilities that are, at least in my mind, necessary to optimize its use?
Thank you very much, John Wallace. Great question, and great to hear August's take on the impressive utility of useful fiction as well. I was lucky enough to chat to his colleague Peter the other week on a podcast about this, so it's always good to reacquaint with that. In terms of artificial intelligence and communications, we're at a very interesting point because we've got a number of considerations to think about when we're looking not only at the tactical battle, but we're looking at the wider operational and strategic sides of things at the same time. And what that is that on the one hand, we are looking potentially in the US within allied militaries of having an exponential increase in the amount of data that we're going to be moving around the battlefield. We talk in the civilian world about the Internet of Things, the connection of everything, effectively, any kind of machine. That's being mirrored in the military sphere with the Internet of Military Things, IOMT. Every platform, system, sensor, base, member of the military, member of the DoD almost, you name it, will be connected. The problem that we're going to have is that the ability to handle and move that data is going to eclipse human cognition. And as a result, AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning techniques will become absolutely fundamental to that. But it brings us in one hand, this answers a question, but it also raises a huge number of other questions that we have to tackle. And I think one of the challenges we've got is we're having to solve the problems while we're doing this. We don't really have a convenient sort of D-Day jump-off time where we can say, okay, from 2030, everything's going to be AI-enabled in terms of things like joint all-domain command and control, whatever it might be. We've got to work up to that. We've got to answer all these questions and be ready at 2030 to take the leap, go for it, and start using these artificial intelligence, AI, and ML-driven techniques. We're having to do it as we're implementing it, and that can make things, I think, very challenging.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Let me pull the string on the whole discussion of data for a minute. I've heard it said that data is the new ammunition, and that AI development and its use are dependent on data. Yet I haven't heard a heck of a lot about how to capture, catalog, tag data for future use. In fact, I heard a gentleman from senior executive from Microsoft not too long ago said he thought we ought to just be capturing data even though we aren't sure what to do with it because the storage of data has become so inexpensive. Are we missing something with regard to data that we need to be concerned about in this future world where AI is enabling autonomy? First to you, Tom, and then August, I'll give you an opportunity to comment.
General, another great question. Yeah, I mean, the data is the new ammunition. I've also heard data called the new oil and the new gold. So it's collecting all of these monikers. I think one of the challenges, as you rightly flag, we are going to be facing an exponential amount of data. Now, one of the things being talked about is edge computing regarding this, and somehow having the algorithms and having the hardware and software, if you like, right at the tactical edge, and getting that to do as much of the work as possible in terms of sorting the data and sharing it. If we go back to the Vietnam War and think about that, an anecdote that I like to share regarding Vietnam was that the US Army deployed, I think for the first time, ground-based surveillance radars that were designed to monitor certain areas for human activity, for Viet Cong activity, vehicles moving around, all of these kind of things. Now, one of the problems with those radars was they quickly became inundated with all kinds of information because you've got animals moving around, you've got humans moving around very innocently, civilians going about their daily business, vehicles doing much the same. So you suddenly got a deluge of data, and still you've got the bad guys subsumed in that. They're still able to use that data as camouflage. So you need to have the processing done as early as possible and have what you want being able to sorted from that and shared with the cloud and moved. But again, this brings us back to the problem of trust. You need to be able to trust the processing that is doing that and the technology that's doing that. Because if you don't trust it and if it's not getting you the data you want, it simply becomes useless. In fact, it can become worse. It can become a hindrance. So I think the edge computing revolution is quite interesting, and I think it does offer potential. But as an add-on to that, I think you've also got to build the human trust in it in order to ensure it can be used to its full potential. And that's really, for me, the only way you can probably avoid data deluge, which risks becoming a very serious problem.
Thanks, Tom. August, anything to add to the discussion about data and its utility and in its importance and maybe getting deluged by it?
You know, I think it's like 11 years since it was a British mathematician, Clive Humby, who first said data is the new oil. And, you know, we're still kind of waking up to its importance at the policy realm. You know, as an outsider and observer, you know, I think that's part of the AI conversation right now in the United States, which is, you know, to say that, you know, none of the kind of AI magic is going to happen unless we commit serious resources and energy to the question of like, how does the U.S. government, and it's true with the private sector too, you know, manage, operate, exchange, et cetera, curate, refine data. And it's hard to resource that. You know, I think if you were to kind of poll people who are in those fields, actively trying to work with data sets, you'd probably find a lot more frustration than like joy in that process, because it's laborious, it's expensive, and often not what people want to spend money on. You know, to the point about overloading, you know, kind of human cognition with more information than we can handle. I mean, we're kind of already there. And I think we're learning how to develop software that can help manage, you know, our own relationship with information. But still, you know, at a fundamental point, you know, we're kind of, I think, reached our asymptotic limit. So when it comes to the cognitive warfare, having the ability for machines to manage their own data collection more effectively through, as Thomas said, you know, AI edge computing, whether it's a drone or a UUV or, you know, in a larger capability aboard a destroyer, for example, managing a whole battle group, that's inevitable, and that has to happen faster. Similarly, there's some really interesting design questions. You know, I've written a lot about, you know, augmented reality and the narratives that we produce, and I think we're gonna see actually that being probably, you know, kind of a real challenge to integrate that in a way that lets people understand what they need to be seeing. Whether we see more haptics, you know, using your own kind of neurology to interact with information in a way that's very different than the paradigms today, where we're kind of glued to screens. I think we have to be open to those kinds of like human, machine integration, human software integration to help solve this problem. I don't mean like breaking the blood, kind of skin barrier with devices per se, but really thinking through like neuroception and how we understand our environment. Neuroscience is still kind of trying to figure that out, but that's going to help us kind of crack this problem.
Yeah, August, and you mentioned augmented reality. Do you see augmented reality as primarily a training tool, or is it actually an operational additive, if you will, at the tactical edge?
I would expect if it can be developed as a training tool, and then it can be refined for operational use. And it may be the cycle is flipped, right? That we need to begin experimenting with that. The same kind of size, weight, power, considerations that go into any military hardware, I think, are going to be really challenging for augmented reality. So you may actually see that stuff coming from the commercial side, particularly in social media, that may be migrated and kind of used, just like small drones, for example, have been kind of pioneering, tactical operations, from insurgent groups and things like that. So I would expect that the military may not actually be leading on that, and it may be lagging, but it's going to be shaping how we perceive our environment, particularly an information game, cognitive warfare game, as we start seeing that again take shape in social media. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, terrific. Let me turn our discussion a little bit toward electronic warfare, if I might. We've heard a lot about Russia's EW capabilities in Ukraine. And Tom, I was wondering how you think, if you look into your crystal ball, how AI can help us in addressing these EW capabilities if NATO finds itself in a future confrontation with Russia. I guess future is a poor word, because we're in a confrontation with them through our proxy anyway. But anyway, how do you think AI can help us in working through the clutter and the reality of EW capabilities of an adversary?
I think one of the things that's hallmarking the conflict between Ukraine and Russia at the moment is that, from the electromagnetic point of view, it is taking place in a highly congested environment and highly contested as well. If we go back and look at the last 20 years, I mean, Afghanistan is an instructive example in this, that you were NATO and allied nations were primarily operating in an environment where Taliban communications were rudimentary at best and were civilian standard, primarily relying on cellular communications or the internet. And that was to an extent replicated in, if you like, the post-Saddam era in Iraq. One of the problems you've got now is that you've got the electromagnetic dimension of that war being fought in the same environment where civilians are using the spectrum every single day. We just need to go on Twitter or any social media outlet to see the amount of traffic that is being uploaded from Ukrainian patriots, from Russian propagandists, to inform the world of what's going on or to promote a particular narrative. So within that morass of congestion, if you will, there's a need to find out and to find the signals you're really interested in. Now, what we've been lucky with the Russians so far is that a lot of the technology they've been using has been comparatively unsophisticated. A lot of their communications transmissions, military communications transmissions, have occurred in clear, for instance. They've not been using frequency hopping as much as we would expect. They've not been using other ComSec and TransSec protocols to such an extent. Now, this has made, you could argue, the signal intelligence gatherer's life a little easier. But this should not be taken for granted. And I think, to come back to your original question, the application of AI will become absolutely vital, because it's an oft-quoted line in electronic warfare, an oft-quoted cliche about finding the electromagnetic needle in the haystack. But it is true. And in an environment like Ukraine, you have to ask the question to which you can have the best SIGINT boys and girls, men and women in the world, but can they find that telltale signal of interest using their existing equipment, unassisted by AI and machine learning, in an environment like Ukraine? My fear is that they will not be able to. And my hope is that that's where these techniques can come to the fore and assist their task.
Do you think the lack of sophistication that you mentioned in the EW realm by the Russians is a function of capability, or are they purposefully not using some of their capabilities to deny us access to the discovery of those capabilities?
From what we know in the open source domain, the lion's share of Russian land forces EW capability, at least, has been deployed and used in the Ukrainian theater. One of the problems that Russia has is that on paper, it has a lot of new electronic warfare equipment to support the army, for instance, at the tactical and operational levels, and some strategic bits and bobs as well. The problem for Russia is that a lot of the new systems that we're seeing were actually systems that were designed 20, 30 years ago. And the designs were put on ice when the Russians ran out of cash at the end of the day. And so following 2010 and the new look Russian military and the defense reforms that came in, a lot of these designs were dusted off and reintroduced. But one of the interesting things that we've seen, and this is in the public domain, where the United Services Institute did a very good report about this, is that the innards, if you like, the guts of the EW equipment that's been captured or has been revealed through battle damage is really quite basic. I mean, the Russians are using a lot of off-the-shelf commercial chips that they're having to buy on the black market from Western suppliers. So the sophistication is not as we would expect, but I would also caution that's not an excuse for complacency. It's always very easy whenever you think, well, perhaps it wasn't quite as intense as we thought, for policymakers then to translate that into, well, that's absolutely splendid because that means we don't have to spend money on it. I would argue you still do. And I certainly wouldn't take the if you like, the performance of Russian EW we've seen so far for granted. And I think we need to think in NATO that it could get very, very capable in the future as lessons are learned. And we need to be prepared for that.
Are the EW capabilities we attribute to Russia the same capabilities that we should attribute to other protagonists like China or Iran, or are there other capabilities that we haven't seen but we know exist?
It's a good question. What's interesting between the three countries you just mentioned is that there is a degree of electronic warfare cross-fertilization. We know, for instance, Iran has purchased Russian land forces EW equipment. China is thought to have done so as well. However, Iran and China to a greater extent, are, as Donald Rumsfeld would say, they're the known unknowns. We simply do not know how capable Chinese electronic warfare will be. And there's certainly a lot of investment that's going into it, not only in terms of the hardware, but the software, things like AI, advanced waveform development, all of these kind of things. So I would almost wager that the Chinese threat is perhaps a more significant one, or perhaps a more capable one. But that being said, we mustn't write off the other two either. And we must also assume that levels of cooperation between all three powers will probably increase and deepen in the future.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question from our audience that was sent in, and let me ask each of you to comment in turn. I'll start with you, August. And the question is, how will the current global competition over semiconductor technology potentially affect the computing power of both the U.S., its allies, and also U.S. adversaries? August, do you care to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the competition has become a national level priority for the U.S. and the impact of restrictions or sanctions plus production are going to start having that like strategic impact. The thing that has been on my mind for a long time about this, even going back to when we wrote Ghost Fleet, was during say a large scale or even small scale conflict with China, what happens to those global supply chains? And I think that's something obviously it's become part of the larger conversation and the reshoring of facilities and capabilities in the U.S. But there's still a pretty big gap between when that is going to be able to come online, even with the kind of increased investment we've seen over the last 18 months. In terms of a competitive space, for the U.S. And its allies as a community, against China. I mean, I feel like that is an area where, we have some advantages because we have history, but if we underestimate the Chinese ability to innovate internally, the Chinese ability to navigate the global supply chains even in a restricted way, I think we do so at our peril. And so assuming advantage, in any area in modern and future warfare, I think is potentially foolhardy. And so probably, having a lot of humility in how we assume, even if we make these big structural strategic investments, that they may simply, not be the advantage that we hope. And likewise, that our adversaries, again, a nation like China, are also kind of making their own moves that are going to have that level of almost parity, perhaps.
Okay, thanks, August. Tom, any comments about the global semiconductor wars that are going on?
I think August absolutely hit the nail on the head with that. I mean, in terms of the supply chain at the moment, we've got two things to think about, I think. Firstly, there's the deliberate shock, if you like. There is, heavens forbid, a confrontation, let's say China and Taiwan go head to head, and that may mean US involvement, and that may mean the supply of semiconductors being disrupted. It could also mean the kind of situation we saw during the pandemic. I'm sure we all remember the MV Ever Given, the container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal for a few days. I think March 2020 had to be freed and caused significant disruption and cause significant costs. So we've also got to think about these sort of unintended shocks that we might experience. Broadly speaking, I mean, just my personal view, but I think the trend of reshoring advanced semiconductor manufacture back to the US, back into Europe and things like that is very, very healthy. We have to see these components as a strategic resource. But I think there's another way to look at this as well, which is that by establishing the fabs and these plants and everything to build these components we so desperately need, we're not only supporting those industries, but we're supporting a whole ecosystem that goes along with that. So that includes things like the education of the individuals required to work in those facilities, the supply chains nationally that are going to support those fabs, and then the buyers. And it's really, if you like it, in many ways, like other industries, like aviation, let's say, or the car industry, whatever it might be. You're not just looking at the end result of, we get this strategic component we desperately need, but we're also investing in a lot of other areas which will benefit not only that industry, but others. So I think it's important to look at it through a strategic lens, but not just in terms of the semiconductors, but in terms of what it does for other areas of national industry, education, those kind of things, because this is an opportunity as well. And it's something that I think we can exploit, not only for the military, but for the better of the countries concerned.
Thanks, Tom. I've got another question from our listening audience, and I think it's most appropriately directed toward you, August. And it is as follows: is the United States investing enough and moving fast enough in developing and deploying robotic and drone technology across the Department of Defense? And I acknowledge this is an opinion thing rather than directly
Sure.
attributable to you, but any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to go faster in how we adopt robotics and AI in its various forms. And the reason is as much as was just said. There is an ecosystem around each of these discrete technologies or even platforms that takes a long time to develop. The manpower, the kind of education system, et cetera, the staffing. To go with that, it's a long tail. If there are areas that I could, see, a lot more, focus and energy on, it would be, as we talked about earlier, data would be one. In terms of robotics, I think the, unmanned aerial at the kind of larger attritable, platforms and systems is certainly an area, given the realities of large scale conflict with China, that we have to be very serious about, especially as it comes to carrier aviation. And similarly, the large expanse of the Pacific is going to require a lot of presence by both, sensing capabilities, but also small units. Whether it's kind of Marine Corps operating concept type deployments of small teams. So thinking about logistics and resupply using autonomous systems is going to be vastly important, because that also sidesteps some of the thornier aspects, at least in the communications and public relations side, about lethal autonomous systems. It would seem to me that logistics, for example, would be an area in the Pacific you could have a determinate and very decisive advantage potentially, because incremental, aircraft availability or sustainment for small units can have an outsized impact, especially over time. And so, to me, that feels like an area that we're not doing nearly enough on, at least in the open, unclassified world that I know of.
It is, in your mind, is the speed of development of these capabilities limited by money invested, or the technology itself, or the acceptance of the technology, or policy, or all of the above? I'm interested in your comments.
Yeah, you could, probably put that all in a shaker and create a cocktail out of the reasons why. But I would say the culture piece is huge. If you look at, again, the history of unmanned systems and carrier aviation as one example, that's a very difficult hurdle to climb. We'll see how the Army, for example, looks at autonomy, in ground combat, platforms and capabilities. Similarly, again, if we want to go back to the AI, facets of this, many of the most important advantages may actually not come from the kinetic implementation of those kinds of software capabilities, but on maintenance or personnel management. Because imagine if you're buying time back for a unit, right? Any unit now that's implementing a new robotics capability is stealing time away from whether it's marksmanship training or other kinds of kind of skilling that has to happen of human soldiers. So being able to kind of free more time to be more modern is, in fact, I think, a kind of somewhat counterintuitive but crucial aspect of using AI for a modern military. And the forces that can do that on the back end, on the boring, the dull, not necessarily the dirty and dangerous, are going to probably have more battlefield advantage in the next 5 or 10 years. But again, culturally, that's really hard to do.
If you were to look into your crystal ball, what would you expect to be the next most useful, fieldable AI and autonomy capability that we would see in routine use at the tactical edge?
I think going back to that question of logistics and resupply in very contested environments, we talk about attritable strike platforms, but again, look at the Pacific, look at the geography that is going to vex allied and American forces, coming up with ways to more rapidly resupply forces that are on the move, like a naval squadron, or whether it's small units of commandos, or whether it's aircraft doing search and rescue for downed pilots. Being able to kind of create that kind of sustained effectiveness is going to be really hard. I mean, history showed us that, right? During the Second World War. So that to me would be an area where I would really like to see that kind of focus.
Okay, thanks. So I've one of the questions that keeps gnawing at me, and maybe at others, is what are the dangers of us, the U.S. and like-minded allies? What are the dangers of limiting the use or the development of AI and autonomy due to questions of ethics, while our potential adversaries are not similarly limited? August, any care to comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I work on an AI ethics project out of the Peace Research in Oslo, looking at a lot of these very questions. And my take on it is that though there may be ethical norms that, say, Russia or China may not be willing to adhere to, that for our way of warfare, for working within the alliance constructs and partner constructs that are part of how we conceive of our operations in the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s, having a shared set of values of which military and technological ethics play a foundational part, it's essential. We have to remember that the decisions that we will make as a nation affect our allies too, and we want to create interoperability from the outset, and the ethical piece is part of that. DoD is doing a lot of recent work on this and leaning forward, as are our allied nations, like the UK, like France. I don't believe that confers disadvantage, and if anything, it actually may reflect the realities of operating in a data-enriched world where if data is the new ammunition, being able to access and responsibly, especially in non-kinetic ways, whether it's for cognitive campaigns, information operations, et cetera, being able to be that kind of a trusted partner, so to speak, is going to be vital. And so that leaves the question of then, how does the defense establishment, the different communities within, lead on this conversation? And I think by being open and public about them, of which many of the kind of highest level conversations have been pretty diverse and open armed. I think that has to continue because that is, I think, one of the strategic kind of assets we're going to have when it comes to AI robotics, is developing a robust and transparent ethics framework.
Thanks. Tom, any comments relative to in the EW realm relative to ethics and its application?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the points that August was raising just now, and I'm very much inclined to agree because, I mean, writ large, I think one of the discussions I've heard over the past couple of years, I guess, is speculation on whether there'll be an eventual sort of compact, if you like, or movement, global movement, that will codify, if you like, a set of ethical rules of the road regarding AI and robotics that you've had in other areas, be it chemical weapons conventions, nuclear weapons, all of these kind of things. And I think what you might then have is a situation where the holdouts for that become conspicuous by their absence. And should Russia and China go down the route of developing or using AI in such a fashion rather, that is seen as deeply unethical and uses it on the battlefield, we're also fighting wars in the information space. And what we've seen, for instance, in Syria, when the Syrian government used chemical weapons, was it created not only global revulsion, but it also resulted in a US-led series of airstrikes and cruise missile strikes against targets associated with the President Assad's chemical weapons infrastructure. So I think in a sense, you could almost use the sort of ethical aspect of this as a force multiplier. If you're the US, if you're NATO, saying, well, there's certain things we're not going to do because they're not ethical. And if our adversaries do them, then they're showing themselves up. And that could also mean quite severe consequences for those course of actions. To come back to the EW space, I mean, one of the things, referring to the questions regarding drones, one of the things I really would like to see, not only with the US DoD, but writ large across NATO, is more use of drones, particularly as a supplement for land forces electronic warfare. We still have a situation where if we're deploying land forces EW units, company, battalion size, whatever they are, on the battlefield, they are still, to an extent, primarily limited by the antennas that they can place. And these might have a range of 10, 15 kilometers at best, perhaps a little bit more. A lot of cheap or let's say inexpensive disposable UAVs that you can fly and really move downrange gives you the ability to capture a huge amount more spectrum. Now, you're capturing this big swathe of spectrum, and then you need the AI, of course, to start sorting through this. And I get the sense, actually, with how this discussion's been going, that it's almost impossible to talk about things like AI without talking about things like the drones and the communications and all of this, because we have to take such a holistic viewpoint of it. But certainly in the EW space, I would like to see the potential of drones being exploited much more, not just for the imagery intelligence collection, but also for the SIGINT side of things.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question from one of our outside participants. I think it was perpetrated by one of your comments, August. And the question is, they're curious to hear more about how the commercial sector is or will lead in terms of human-machine team approach, in that the sheer volume of data available to the private sector might give an advantage to the private sector, and something that the military can learn from.
I think that's a really interesting comment and an expression of the larger trend, of the last, I'd say, 2 decades, where, a lot of the technological innovation predominantly is coming out of private sector, entities. It's not necessarily national labs or the armed services, et cetera. And, the more you get into the software, defined aspects of warfare, how many users you have, how much data you're producing is really driving a lot of how effective you are. with whatever it is you're creating. And so there is an inherent advantage that a fast-moving commercial company that's using development practices that are much quicker, for example, than what the U.S. Government entities will. It's always going to have an advantage. And fundamentally, trust, as we've kind of been talking around, I think today is often about reps, right? How much exposure do you have to a given capability? And that may offer actually a way in for defense-specific capabilities that are derived from or mirror many of the actions and habits and norms that we already are bringing from our civilian lives. For considering the future force of say 2030 or 2040, it's obvious, right, that those in our country in an all-volunteer force are going to come from the civilian world. So what are people who are coming from the civilian world already naturally good at? How meshed are they already with their devices, with different algorithms, with different platforms, and figuring out how to utilize that. Some of that may be done in partnership, some of that may be more mimetic, but from that human machine teaming aspect, really thinking about the human factors piece and the software element as much as any kind of robotic element, I think is vital, because we have to be able to kind of see ourselves in those future worlds, and the more we understand that through what's level set today with technology, but also is going to feel like a natural progression. It's vital to do that.
So you think the more that AI and autonomy become routine in our daily lives, it'll be more acceptable at the tactical edge that we're talking about?
Yeah, not just acceptable, but imperative. It's a bit like where people have to work in environments in the defense ecosystem where they can't bring their personal devices, right? The reality, although we know on the electronic warfare side the perils, of course, as Ukraine has shown repeatedly, of emitting, right? You emit, you die potentially. At the same time, we need to prepare ourselves for a world in which, though we can train an 18-year-old to be trusted with an M4, soon an M5, we also need to train them and be able to trust them with their own smartphone, right? Because that strategic corporal, paradigm of, the 90s or whatever is still important, but it's not just in the execution of a tactical mission, but also the maintenance and presence, online, and how they use, different, again, increasingly AI-driven software capabilities. So absolutely, I think we have to be, kind of wrapping both of our arms around this concept and figuring out ways to turn it to our advantage, because that is something I think that our society, in the American sense, and in the European sense too, I would say, can leverage to our advantage.
Do you sense that when we're talking about small tactical units, the tactical edge units, that there is resistance, or do they want it to move faster and integrate more into their daily operations?
I mean, I don't want to speak, for communities that I'm not part of per se, but I would observe, just based on what I've kind of seen and heard, that they're, becoming competent and if not expert, which is the goal, it takes time. And so choosing which systems and capabilities, if you're having to learn to use a drone that's going to clear a building, and that's, again, taking away time from, combat life-saving, practice or marksmanship or, again, PT or other, aspects of unit or leader development, you have to be really willing to kind of get the buy-in from that, especially at the enlisted level, that leadership, to say, this is worth our time. This is going to save, lives. This is going to help us accomplish our mission. And I think being really operationally minded and talking about some of these capabilities is crucial to be able to make that connection, to say that it's not just worth the budget. It's not just worth the doctrine and policy development, but we have to convince the people the actual users, that it's going to be useful. There's nothing worse. And I've heard these anecdotes, and I even wrote a short story called Discards off this a few years ago, than, being given technology that doesn't work. A friend recounted in Afghanistan having Connex containers full of sensors and robotic stuff that just didn't have any application to the environment they were in. So every time they'd show up at a new outpost, there'd be a Connex full of like electronic junk. And I started thinking through what's the junk of the next war? What's the stuff that we thought was going to work really well that actually is going to have no relevance to actual mission, right? And I think those kind of thought exercises, they're not abstract, they're real. And if anything, again, the operations and missions of the last 2 decades have shown that.
Yeah, I would just comment or make the observation that the autonomy and AI, if applied to some of the more routine training requirements like combat lifesaver or like marksmanship, we may just find that we can abbreviate that kind of training and still make it as effective as it once was, and use that time saved for other pursuits like the integration of capabilities into our units, and therefore more acceptance of those capabilities. Just
That's a great point.
From my perspective. Obviously, the war in Ukraine is the current fight, but I would ask each of you in turn, starting with you, Tom, to give an opinion or an observation about what it signals as far as future war, and in particular, the potential future use of AI and autonomy.
I think in terms of the indicators, I mean, what we've observed so far, one of the strongest ones, I think, is the use of drones. One of the things that's interesting for me is that for 20 years, it seems, we talked about drones and we talked about how important they would be, and they've grown exponentially in each conflict, probably since the Arab-Israeli wars of the 1960s. But we're in a reality now where they're going to absolutely saturate the battlefield, and these are not easy targets to engage. So not only do we have to look at how we can fit drones into our doctrine, if you will, particularly at the tactical edge, these small drones, often like civilian hobby drones that you're using, but also how do we protect ourselves against them? So I think that's one of the big issues. I think the second major factor is, how do we fight a war in an increasingly complex information space? I cast my mind back to the Balkans wars of the 1990s, and also the first Gulf War. And I remember, like many people, being absolutely glued to the television every evening, making sure I watched the evening news bulletin. Of course, there'd only really be one evening news bulletin, unless you were lucky enough to have CNN or something like that. And you had two narratives really that were going on. You had, in the case of the Balkans, the protagonists, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, etc. And you had NATO, or the UN, let's say. You had a finite number of protagonists. Now you've got a huge number. And you're never quite sure, particularly in the social media world and online, you're never quite sure of the provenance of the information that you're reading or where it's from. And so in many ways, I think for allied nations, the US and her allies, it's the consideration of potentially having to fight a war, but having to fight a war where they may not necessarily always own the narrative, and where that may ebb and flow, and how do you accommodate that? Because wars are often lost at home. And I think the way that we absorb information now and the way information is distributed makes that even more of a danger, and something we really have to think about. So they're two of the big takeaways from me. But of course, sadly, we're facing a rather grim anniversary next week, 1 year since the invasion started. I think the one thing we can say, sir, with certainty, and General, I'm sure you'll chime with this, is that in the staff colleges and in the universities, we'll be digesting the lessons of this for years to come. Not so much really what can we teach the Ukrainians, but I think it will be increasingly a case of what can the Ukrainians teach us.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. August, any comments?
One of the biggest takeaways for me has been, how many of the continuities of 20th century conflicts are still present in the 21st. This is an unusual, moment to realize, especially as someone who thinks constantly about, what are the next future, conflicts going to be like, where, you can have imagery is of trench warfare that would not look out of place, in the earlier part of the prior century. And at the same time, understanding that, from space, we're having AI sort and sift imagery that is strategic, as Tom said, for the information campaign. That being able to hold those two things in tension, I think, is hard for a lot of people who work on future conflict, because we often get very parochial, or people do, about their given technology or area of expertise. And I think really understanding how complex and actually hard to predict and truly crystal ball, what's coming. But if I could, draw that from that, one of the continuities but there will always be elements of the old with the new together. And that we have to be, I think, open to the fact that technology isn't going to solve some problems. The tank, for example, is, I think, a representational, factotum of this kind of conversation about, we are in the software era of warfare, on the cusp of it at least, but yet we're still having a really intense debate about the value of the tank, 70, 60 ton, whatever, piece of mechanized equipment to hold territory, right? To breach, formation, breach, defenses, et cetera. We're seeing trench warfare and, having intense debates about defense industrial production of unguided artillery shells. And this is just, a conflict that is, as Tom said, is a year old. Imagine, again, transplanting some of these conversations to a future conflict in the Asia Pacific region, particularly with China. And I think we really want to try to understand future warfare through that lens of those kind of continuities, and Ukraine is a constant reminder of that.
Okay. Thanks, August, and thanks, Tom, for your comments as well. We are about to our scheduled closing time. I would ask each of our panelists if you have any final comments that you want to provide to the audience, and then I'll turn it back to Scott Newbern for any final comments from his perspective. So, Tom, over to you first of all. Any final comments?
Well, just to say it's been an absolute joy to discuss these issues with you both today, and also to field the questions from our audience. One of the things I'm always enlightened by is that these conversations are conversations without end, and we need to keep them going, not only amongst ourselves, but anybody, I think, who has any connection at all with defense needs to be having this conversation and needs to be thinking about these things. And if we've made some perhaps very small contribution in some way to that, I'm very happy, but I do look forward to continuing the engagement in the future. Thanks,
Tom. August, any final comments?
Likewise, a fascinating conversation that I'm really grateful to have been a part of. If I had a closing, remark, it would be that, as we consider this question of what is future warfare really going to be like, and it may seem unknowable, but I think the closer you can get to understanding the human dimensions of it, particularly through narrative, which is like a story is a technology we're naturally wired for, I think the better picture you can begin to kind of, ascertain, or if not create yourself. And I would encourage people to use creativity to do that on their own.
Okay. Thanks, August. And thanks to both of you for joining in the panel and being such good participants. And I appreciate your commentary. I have nothing but admiration for our two panelists. I wish, again, Peter Singer could have joined us, because I'm sure he could have added to it. But we seem to have covered the topic adequately in the time allotted. And I guess I turn it over to Scott Newbern. Scott, any final comments from your perspective as the host of this thing?
Yeah, sure. Again, thank you to the panelists, Tom and August. And again, sorry Peter couldn't be here. And of course, General Wallace, not only for moderating, but providing your astute thoughts as well. Great conversation. Really appreciate you joining and sharing with us today your experience and insights. And also, I'd like to thank our attendees that joined and provided lots of thought-provoking questions for us. I hope you guys can join us for our next event. That would be great. And maybe just a final takeaway is that in thinking about some of the discussion today, and as a developer and partner in deploying some of the technologies we're talking about, I think it's important to kind of step away from the sensationalism that often gets tagged with when you say things like AI, things driven by popular media like chatbot GPT and those kind of things. And just consider that autonomous systems have been in use for many years, and that, ultimately when we say AI and autonomy, we're really just talking about new methods that create a tool set that we can take advantage of that allows us to augment warfighter capabilities in a safe, secure, and reliable way. And that extends to the discussion we had about networking and connectivity. While those are enablers for some of the larger data capabilities we would like to deploy, conversely, autonomy and AI actually help us create independence and resiliency with respect to those networks, especially in the context of the contested tactical edge. So Anyway, with that, I will close. And again, wherever you are today, I hope you have a great day. Looking forward to you joining us in our next idea room discussion. And thank you.